Hello and welcome to the Department of Theology and Religious Studies here at the University of Nottingham. Today I'm talking to John Milbank, who is Professor of Religion, Politics and Ethics. Hello, John.
Hello, Simon.
We're going to talk today about Henri de Lubac, a key 20th century theologian I know you've done a lot of work on over the last few years. Before we start talking about de Lubac specifically and his importance, I wonder if we could set the scene a little bit. Could you tell us something about the state of theology, Catholic theology at the turn of the 20th century that formed de Lubac's thought?
Yes, well, this is often described as manual theology, and what this meant was that people tended not to study primarily the Bible or study primarily the great Christian thinkers of the past, but to study digests of these thinkers, which were turning them into a kind of false synthesis, and there was a sense of accumulated wisdom that didn't pay any attention to temporal context and so on, as if the story of Catholic thought was just a story of gradual improvement.
Yes.
And it was also presented in a very kind of cut and dried deduction from first principles kind of way. You know, here are the facts of revelation, and from this, if we apply reason, certain things follow. It was rather arid, in a word.
Right. So that was associated with people like Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange.
Yes. I mean, this had been going on for a very long
Right.
time, but he's perhaps the most famous of the so-called manual Thomists. And the irony is that he's sort of very rationalist and very empiricist in actually a rather modern way, even though he's developing a system of thought that's supposed to be resistant to modernity.
Right. So this is what formed Henri de Lubac. And tell us a little bit about his life to start with.
Well, he was born in the north of France, and he spent some time in Hastings in the south of England in a Jesuit house there. He was very badly wounded in the head in the First World War, very traumatized by that. Initially seen as an enfant terrible, very much self-educated, really rather little formal training. Somebody really challenging the entire received structure of Catholic thinking. And yet, at the end of his life, totally rehabilitated, seen as one of the architects of Vatican II, and by the end of his life often regarded as a conservative, and indeed somebody who had a lot of doubts about some aspects of Vatican II that he'd actually never been in favour of in the first place. For example, aspects of the liturgical reform.
Right. So if we go back to de Lubac's work itself, he publishes this work, Surnaturel in French, translated as The Mystery of the Supernatural, that was really groundbreaking, I think. And what was it about that work?
Actually, that Mystery of the Supernatural is a later work.
Right.
Surnaturel is still being translated. The initial work, and it was really a collection of quite disparate essays and historical studies. Not something that you would obviously think of. This is revolutionary, but it was revolutionary precisely because the whole way of looking at things since the Baroque period, since roughly the 17th century, was to make a very sharp distinction between nature and grace and between reason and faith. So the idea was that there's a kind of autonomy to the natural realm, the realm in which you have human ethics, you have politics, you have theories of art, and so on and so forth, and also philosophical conclusions, and that can all go on quite independently of revelation. Maybe without reference to God, although within this realm you can have rational arguments that establish the bare existence of God. And then on top of that, you have revelation, which tends, the thinking about revelation tends also to revolve in its own circle. You have certain revealed propositions, and from these you deduce certain things, certain consequences, certain probabilities follow. This is also very rationalistic, even though it has a rather kind of fideistic starting point, because there's no joint between these two things. And Henri de Lubac did was remind the world that for the Church Fathers, both Latin and Greek, and for most of the scholastics up to the time of Aquinas, there was in fact a paradoxical natural desire for the supernatural, so that nature wasn't regarded as complete in itself. It was regarded as being in a kind of anticipation, or waiting for revelation, which will alone complete human existence, even alone complete the cosmos. So a much more historical attitude, and history was what the manuals had really ignored. Both history and the whole realm of imagination and mediation by images, if you like. In the Middle Ages, there'd been the idea of the Book of Nature and the Book of the Bible, and the idea that you could only really read these books together. And Henri de Lubac is really restoring that. So he's saying, in a way, he's saying that revelation is much more important for natural thinking than people thought. But on the other hand, natural thinking is much more important for thinking about the Bible than people thought. So, and this is one reason why he can be read two ways, as either a conservative or a liberal. But to grasp him, you have to hold on to both aspects and see that he's neither liberal nor conservative. He's thinking through the original radicalism of orthodoxy, if you like to put it that way.
Right. So we can see him as part of this ressourcement movement.
Absolutely, and that's a movement looking not to deny the work of the scholastics, but to say that they are reflecting on, if you like, the more fundamental thought of the Church Fathers, which is much more attendant to history, symbolism, biblical exegesis, narrative. It's not hastening on too quickly to speculative and dialectical issues. It's not that these people denied the importance of all that, not at all, but the aim was, there had been an idea that really Aquinas has sort of summed up so well all this patristic legacy, you don't actually need to go back to these authors themselves. The ressourcement theologians thought that Aquinas himself would be horrified by that attitude. He wouldn't have been that arrogant, and that we need to carry on doing precisely what he was doing. Look at all the authorities, the ancient philosophers, the Bible, the fathers, and keep meditating on those sources. And precisely by not going back to the sources, we'd got a kind of caricatured view of what Aquinas thought, especially attributing to Aquinas this sharp separation between nature and grace, and not seeing that there's not just natural questioning about what's the origins of everything, but a positive kind of erotic lure of something obscure. And it's a paradox, because revelation is a free gift. And so how do you anticipate something that has not yet arrived? And of course the answer is that in a way that's always obscurely latent, that God, it's impossible for God to create without creating human beings and without orientating human beings back to him. The whole thing goes round in a circle. And if you read Aquinas carefully, there's no question but that's the way he thinks. It's only if you take a few passages that make distinctions, to be sure, between nature and grace, and don't look at the bigger picture, which makes it clear that these distinctions are relative distinctions. They're not absolute distinctions. And it's remarkable the ruses to which people are still going, to try to deny something that's not really open to debate.
Right. Could you say something about one of de Lubac's other very important publications, Corpus Mysticum, which is another historical study that he's very well known for? What's Corpus Mysticum all about, the mystical body?
Well, in a way, this was equally revolutionary, because extraordinarily enough, thinking about the Church had come to be in quite judicial, sort of pragmatic terms, so that the sacraments, particularly the Eucharist, was seen as kind of like an isolated miracle, and then the people in charge of this miracle had great power, but that was often thought of in all too worldly ways. The kind of thing, that some of the reformers were quite rightly worried about. But Henri de Lubac is suggesting that their diagnoses are not quite right, and that the whole problem is that we lost the sense of the connection between the Eucharistic body and the body of the Church. And that later on people started to talk about the Church as primarily the mystical body, whereas earlier the Eucharist was the mystical body, and the Church was the true body of Christ. And so the loss of this sense that the presence of Christ in the Eucharist can't be separated from his presence in the congregation, and that this presence in the congregation really is, in a sense, a continuation of the Incarnation. So the Church has both a Christological aspect as well as a pneumatological aspect that was still led by the Spirit, and therefore, the physicality of the Church, its incarnation in society, is something that resonates with a lot of Anglican theology, in the sense that the Church itself is the true society. In another very famous book, Catholicism, de Lubac really renewed the social thinking of the Church by stressing that it's not the Church saying what politicians should do, it's the Church itself that goes beyond politics and anticipates to some degree the kingdom.
Thank you very much indeed, John. That's all we have time for today. We hope that you'll be able to join us again for another of our films in the Theology Department at the University of Nottingham. Thank you.